The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound cutting through the oppressive silence of the kitchen. Marella Donovan stood at the granite counter, her trembling fingers gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The afternoon light filtered through expensive sheer curtains, casting pale shadows across the pristine floors she'd mopped that morning, while her children napped. Everything in this house gleamed with the kind of perfection that money could buy, but couldn't maintain on its own. That fell to her. Always to her. She pressed one hand against her chest, feeling her heart hammering irregularly beneath her palm. The panic attack had started small, just a flutter of anxiety while she was folding the endless mountain of laundry, but it had grown into something that felt like drowning on dry land. Her lungs wouldn't fill properly. Her vision swam at the edges. The walls seemed to be closing in, despite the generous dimensions of this kitchen that could have housed her entire childhood apartment. Upstairs, she could hear the faint sound of Sophia's baby monitor, the soft breathing of her 2-year-old daughter still deep in her afternoon nap. Marco, 4 years old and usually a bundle of restless energy, was also sleeping soundly in his room. They had no idea their mother was falling apart one floor below them, her carefully constructed facade of stability crumbling like sand between desperate fingers. Marella reached for her phone with shaking hands. The screen lit up, showing the wallpaper photo, a picture from 2 years ago when Lorenzo had actually been present for Marco's birthday party. They looked like a perfect family in that frozen moment. His arm around her waist, her genuine smile, the children laughing between them. She barely recognized that version of herself anymore. That woman had still believed her husband's absences were temporary. That woman had still held on to hope. She opened their message thread, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. The last message from him was from 3 days ago. "We'll be late. Don't wait up." Before that, "Meeting ran long." And before that, "Business dinner, back tomorrow." A pattern so consistent it could have been scheduled. She'd stopped asking questions months ago. The answers, when she got them, were always variations of the same dismissive reassurances. The Vascari Empire required constant attention. His responsibilities couldn't be shirked. She needed to understand the sacrifices required of his position. But understanding didn't make it easier to breathe right now. Understanding didn't stop her hands from shaking. Understanding didn't fill the crushing void of being utterly alone in a marriage that was supposed to be a partnership. Marella typed 3 letters. SOS. She stared at the message for a long moment before hitting send. It felt simultaneously dramatic and completely inadequate. What else could she say? "I'm having a panic attack and there's no one here to help me, and I'm terrified I'm going to pass out while our children are sleeping upstairs." Would that make a difference? Would Lorenzo's reaction change if she spelled out her desperation more clearly? The message showed as delivered, then read. She waited, watching the screen with desperate intensity. Surely he would respond immediately. Surely those 3 letters, universally understood as an emergency signal, would cut through whatever business meeting or family obligation currently occupied his attention. Surely the man she'd married, the man who'd once promised to always protect her, would see that message and call. 1 minute passed, then 2. The typing indicator never appeared. Marella felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been developing hairline fractures for months finally splitting clean through. She set the phone face down on the counter and focused on trying to breathe steadily. In through her nose, counting to 4. Hold for 4. Out through her mouth for 4. The breathing exercise her therapist had taught her, back when she'd briefly had time to attend therapy appointments before Lorenzo had questioned whether they were really necessary. "You have everything you need," he'd said, his tone reasonable, but firm. "A beautiful home, financial security, healthy children. Many women would be grateful for what you have, Kara. These expensive therapy sessions seem indulgent." She hadn't argued. She'd learned not to argue about things that mattered, because losing those arguments hurt worse than simply accepting defeat from the start. So she'd stopped going to therapy, stopped mentioning her loneliness, stopped expressing needs that were apparently too demanding for a man building an empire. 20 minutes later, with her breathing finally steadying through sheer force of will, Morella picked up her phone again. No new messages. No missed calls. She checked to make sure her service was working, that somehow the response hadn't failed to come through. Everything was functioning perfectly. Lorenzo simply hadn't responded. She opened her contacts and scrolled past his name to her sisters. Julia would come if she called. Would drop everything and drive across town to sit with her until the panic passed. But Julia had her own children, her own responsibilities. And explaining why she was falling apart would require admitting truths Morella had been carefully avoiding for months. Admitting that her marriage was dying by inches. Admitting that she was drowning in isolation. Admitting that Lorenzo's increasingly frequent absences weren't just about business. Because Morella wasn't naive. She'd seen the receipts from restaurants she'd never visited, hotels she'd never stayed in. She'd smelled unfamiliar perfume on his jackets. She'd noticed how his phone never left his possession anymore. How he'd changed his password from their wedding anniversary to something she didn't know. She'd watched him become a stranger who occasionally returned to the house they shared. A house that had become more mausoleum than home. She didn't call Julia. Instead, she went to the sink and splashed cold water on her face, staring at her reflection in the window above. At 32, she still looked young, still pretty according to the rare compliments she received. But her eyes held a weariness that no amount of expensive skincare could address. The kind of tired that came from loving someone who'd stopped loving you back, if he ever truly had. The panic attack gradually subsided, leaving her hollowed out and shaky. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table, cradling the warm mug between her palms. Outside, she could see the manicured garden, the pool that the children would enjoy in summer, the stone pathway leading to the guest house where Lorenzo's security team rotated shifts. All the trappings of wealth and status, all the markers of a successful life. All completely meaningless when she was disappearing inch by inch, and the one person who was supposed to notice didn't even bother to respond to a distress signal. Her phone buzzed. Hope leaped painfully in her chest before she could suppress it. But it wasn't Lorenzo. It was a notification from the bank about a large transaction. She opened it with a sinking feeling, already knowing what she'd find. $50,000 had been transferred from their joint account to an account she didn't recognize. The third such transfer this month. She'd stopped questioning these transactions after Lorenzo had made it clear that his financial dealings were none of her concern. "You handle the household, I handle the business," he'd said, his voice carrying that edge of impatience he always developed when she questioned anything. "This is how it's always been in my family. The women take care of the home. The men take care of everything else." As if raising 2 small children while maintaining a house this size was somehow less important than whatever he did during his endless hours away. As if her contribution didn't matter, didn't count, didn't deserve the basic respect of financial transparency. Morella deleted the notification and set her phone aside. Sophia would wake up soon, full of toddler energy and demands for snacks and attention. Marco would follow shortly after, wanting to play and explore and be read to. They needed her present and functional, not curled up in despair over a husband who'd made it abundantly clear where his priorities lay. She could do this. She'd been doing it for months now, essentially single parenting while maintaining the fiction of an intact marriage. What was one more day of carrying the weight alone? What was one more ignored cry for help in a marriage full of them? But as she climbed the stairs to check on her sleeping children, Morella felt something shift inside her. Something beyond the panic attack's residual trembling. A small, hard kernel of clarity that had been forming for weeks finally crystallized into certainty. This couldn't continue. She couldn't continue like this. Something had to change, even if that change terrified her. Especially because it terrified her. Her phone remained silent in her pocket. Lorenzo's non-response speaking more clearly than any words could. And for the first time in their 5 years of marriage, Morella allowed herself to truly consider what her life might look like without him in it. Not the dramatic explosion of divorce and custody battles and public scandal, but something quieter, something that looked like peace. The thought should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, as she watched Sophia sleep with one small hand curled near her cherubic face, Morella felt something she hadn't experienced in months. A tiny, fragile seed of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that didn't involve slowly disappearing into the shadow of a man who'd stopped seeing her years ago. Lorenzo Viscari stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite, the city spread out beneath him like a glittering kingdom. The amber liquid in his crystal tumbler caught the light from the chandelier behind him, refracting into 1,000 tiny prisms. He'd always appreciated beautiful things, the way they reflected his status, his power, his position at the top of a world that demanded strength and commanded respect. This suite cost more per night than most people earned in a month. But money had never been an object for him. Money was simply a tool, and he had mastered its use long ago. Behind him, Serena Hale emerged from the bathroom wrapped in a silk robe that barely reached mid-thigh, her dark hair still damp from the shower they'd shared. She moved with the kind of calculated grace that had first caught his attention 6 months ago at a charity gala. Everything about her was deliberate, from the way she laughed at his jokes to the exact angle she tilted her head when she looked at him. He wasn't naive enough to believe it was genuine, but that didn't matter. Authenticity was overrated. What mattered was that she made him feel powerful, desired, important in ways his wife had stopped making him feel years ago. "You're thinking too much," Serena said, sliding her arms around his waist from behind, pressing herself against his back. "I can always tell when you're somewhere else." Lorenzo took another sip of his whiskey, not bothering to deny it. "Just business concerns. Nothing that can't wait until morning." That was mostly true. There were always business concerns, always deals being negotiated, territories being managed, problems being solved. The Viscari Empire demanded constant attention, constant vigilance. His father had built it from nothing, had taught Lorenzo from childhood that weakness was death, that sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford, that family legacy was worth any sacrifice. And Lorenzo had learned those lessons well. Perhaps too well, according to his mother during one of their increasingly rare conversations. "You're becoming him," she'd said 6 months ago, her weathered hands gripping his with surprising strength. "Your father, cold, distant, so focused on the empire that you forget what the empire is supposed to protect. Don't make his mistakes, Lorenzo. Don't lose your family while trying to build a dynasty." He'd dismissed her concerns then, had assured her that everything was fine, that Morella understood the demands of his position, that his children would appreciate the security and opportunities he was providing them. Now, standing in this expensive hotel suite with another woman's arms around him, he wondered if his mother had seen something he'd been willfully ignoring. His phone sat on the marble bar counter, face up and silent. He'd felt it vibrate earlier during dinner, had glanced at it briefly, had seen Morella's name and those 3 letters, SOS. His first instinct had been to call her immediately, concern spiking through his chest. But then Serena had leaned close, had whispered something provocative in his ear, and he'd made a calculation. Morella sent those kinds of messages sometimes when she was feeling neglected, dramatic little pleas for attention that never amounted to actual emergencies. Probably another complaint about being lonely, another request for him to come home early, another attempt to make him feel guilty for working hard to provide for his family. He'd deal with it later, he'd decided. After dinner, after a few drinks, after he'd enjoyed this evening that was supposed to help him relax, to decompress from the constant pressure of running an empire that never slept. Morella would understand. She always understood. Eventually. That was what he'd always appreciated about her. her ability to accept the reality of their situation without constant complaint. "Your phone's been lighting up," Serena observed, her tone carefully neutral. She'd learned early in their relationship not to push too hard about his family, not to demand explanations or exclusivity. She played her role perfectly, never asking for more than he was willing to give, always available when he needed distraction, always disappearing discreetly when his real life intruded. It was one of the things he valued about her, that understanding that this arrangement had clear boundaries. "Nothing urgent," Lorenzo said, though he didn't actually know that for certain. He turned in her arms, setting his glass aside to pull her closer. "Where were we before I got distracted?" Serena smiled, that practiced curve of lips that promised pleasure and demanded nothing in return. "I was about to remind you why you like spending time with me." She kissed him, and he let himself sink into it, let himself forget about the message on his phone, the wife at home, the children he barely saw anymore. This was easier, this uncomplicated arrangement where no one expected him to be anything other than successful and generous, where no one looked at him with disappointment in their eyes, where no one made him feel like he was failing simply by being who he was. They moved to the bedroom, and Lorenzo's phone remained on the counter, unread messages accumulating like unpaid debts. He'd check them eventually. Later. When this was over. When he was ready to return to the reality of responsibilities and expectations, and the wife who seemed to look through him rather than at him these days. It was nearly midnight when Serena fell asleep beside him, her breathing deep and even. Lorenzo lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the post-pleasure emptiness settling over him like a familiar coat. This was always the worst part, the moment after the distraction faded, and he was left alone with thoughts he spent most of his time avoiding. Thoughts about how he'd gotten here, how the man who'd once promised to cherish Mirella forever had become the man who couldn't be bothered to respond to her messages. He remembered their wedding day with unexpected clarity. She'd been so beautiful, so full of hope and love and trust. She'd looked at him like he was her entire world, like she believed every promise he made at that altar. And he'd meant those promises then. Had genuinely believed he could be the husband she deserved, while still being the man his empire demanded. But somewhere along the way, those two versions of himself had become incompatible. The man Mirella needed required time, attention, emotional availability, things that felt increasingly impossible to provide when there were always fires to put out, always deals to close, always threats to neutralize. And instead of fighting to bridge that gap, he'd simply let it widen. Had told himself it was necessary, temporary, that she'd understand, because she loved him. Now, lying in expensive sheets that smelled of unfamiliar perfume and betrayal, Lorenzo wondered when understanding had transformed into resignation. When Mirella's patience had curdled into something that looked disturbingly like indifference. He'd noticed it in small ways over recent months, the way she no longer waited up for him, no longer asked about his day, no longer tried to initiate intimacy or conversation. She'd stopped trying, stopped fighting, stopped seeming to care whether he came home at all. He should have been relieved. Instead, he felt a gnawing unease that he couldn't quite name, a sense that something irretrievable was slipping through his fingers while he was too busy to notice or care. His phone buzzed again from the other room. Lorenzo considered ignoring it, letting tomorrow's problems remain tomorrow's. But that unease pushed him out of bed, had him padding naked across the plush carpet to retrieve the device from the bar counter. The screen showed multiple notifications, missed calls from his mother, a text from his attorney about contracts that needed reviewing. And at the bottom, hours old now, Mirella's simple SOS followed by nothing else. Lorenzo opened their message thread, scrolling through the history. When had they stopped having real conversations? Every exchange was logistical now. Reminders about the children's schedules, questions about household matters, brief acknowledgments of his irregular hours. Nothing personal, nothing intimate, nothing that suggested they were anything more than business partners managing the shared enterprise of their family. He should call her, Even now, hours later, he should call to make sure everything was okay, but it was past midnight, and she was probably asleep. And calling now would just confirm that he'd ignored her message for hours while doing exactly what she'd probably suspected he was doing. Tomorrow, he'd deal with it tomorrow. He'd go home early, take her to dinner, remind her why they'd fallen in love in the first place. He'd fix whatever needed fixing. Lorenzo set the phone down and returned to bed, but sleep eluded him. Beside him, Serena stirred, reaching out blindly for him in her sleep. Her hand found his arm, curled around it with possessive comfort, and Lorenzo felt nothing. No affection, no connection, just the hollow satisfaction of a transaction completed. She wanted his money, his status, the lifestyle he could provide. He wanted distraction, validation, the illusion that he was still desirable rather than just successful. It was a fair exchange, he supposed, honest in its dishonesty. Unlike his marriage, which had become an elaborate fiction they both perpetuated for the children's sake. Or maybe just for appearances. Because what would people say if Lorenzo Viscari's marriage fell apart? What would it mean for his reputation, his image, his carefully constructed position of power? The questions circled in his mind until dawn began to creep through the curtains. Serena woke slowly, stretching like a cat, already reaching for him with practiced seduction. And Lorenzo let himself be distracted one more time from the growing certainty that he was making mistakes he wouldn't be able to undo. That somewhere along the way, he'd chosen the wrong priorities, had sacrificed the wrong things, had lost something he'd never be able to recover. But not yet. He didn't have to face that reality yet, not this morning. Not while Serena was smiling at him, not while there were meetings to attend and deals to close, and 1,000 other things that seemed more urgent than going home to a wife who'd stopped expecting him to show up anyway. His phone remained silent on the nightstand. Morella didn't send any follow-up messages, didn't call to explain the SOS, didn't reach out again. And Lorenzo told himself that meant everything was fine. That she'd resolved whatever minor crisis had prompted the message, that there was no reason to feel this growing dread in the pit of his stomach, this sense that he was standing at the edge of a cliff he couldn't see yet. He'd go home eventually. Later. After this meeting. After that call. After one more night of pretending that his life wasn't slowly imploding while he was too busy to notice. But not yet. Morella sat cross-legged on the floor of Sophia's bedroom, surrounded by picture books and building blocks. Her daughter was constructing an elaborate tower that defied basic physics, her little tongue poking out in concentration. In the doorway, Marco was showing her his latest crayon drawing, a chaotic swirl of colors he insisted was a dragon protecting a castle. Their voices filled the room with innocent chatter, demands for attention and approval, the uncomplicated needs of children who still believe their mother could fix anything. If only they knew how close she'd come to breaking completely yesterday. How she'd stood in that kitchen, drowning in panic while they slept peacefully upstairs. How she'd sent that desperate message to their father and received nothing but silence in return. 24 hours had passed since she'd typed those 3 letters. 24 hours of waiting for a response that never came, for a phone call checking on her, for any indication that Lorenzo cared whether she was alive or dead. The silence had been its own kind of answer. "Mama, look." Sophia's tower finally collapsed, blocks scattering across the carpet. Instead of crying, she laughed with pure delight, already gathering pieces to start again. That resilience, that ability to find joy even in failure, made Morella's throat tight with emotion. Her children deserved better than what she was modeling for them, better than a mother slowly disappearing into depression, better than a father who couldn't be bothered to check if his wife was okay, better than a marriage held together by nothing but inertia and fear. Morella's phone sat beside her, face down on the carpet. She'd checked it compulsively throughout the morning, each time hoping and dreading in equal measure. Nothing from Lorenzo. A few texts from Julia about weekend plans. a reminder about Marco's upcoming dentist appointment, the mundane minutiae of life continuing despite her internal crisis. She thought about calling him, demanding to know why he'd ignored her SOS. But what would that accomplish? He'd have an excuse, another story about urgent business, or dying phone batteries, or simply not seeing the message until it was too late to respond. And she'd accept it, like she always did, because what choice did she have? Starting a fight would change nothing. Lorenzo would promise to do better, to be more present, to remember that his family needed him. He'd make those promises with complete sincerity, maybe even believing them himself. And then a week would pass, maybe 2, and everything would return to exactly how it was before. This cycle had repeated so many times she'd lost count. The realization, the confrontation, the promises, the temporary improvement, the gradual slide back into neglect. Over and over, like a carousel she couldn't figure out how to exit. Until yesterday, when something inside her had finally broken beyond her ability to repair it. "Mama sad?" Sophia's small voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Her daughter was standing directly in front of her now, tiny hands reaching out to touch Morella's face with heartbreaking gentleness. Morella forced a smile, pulling Sophia into her lap. "Mama's okay, sweet girl. Just tired." "Daddy make you sad?" Marco asked from the doorway, his voice carrying a perception that children shouldn't have to develop this young. "He's always gone now." The observation landed like a physical blow. So they'd noticed. Of course they'd noticed. Children saw everything, absorbed everything, learned from everything. What was she teaching them about love, about marriage, about how people should treat each other? That it was acceptable to be ignored, to be taken for granted, to slowly disappear while your partner pursued their own interests. "Daddy works very hard," Morella said automatically, the practiced defense she'd been offering for months. "He has a lot of responsibilities." But even as she said it, she heard how hollow it sounded, how it excused behavior that shouldn't be excused, how it taught her children that work was more important than family, that providing money was sufficient when what they really needed was presence. Marco's expression suggested he didn't believe her. At 4 years old, he was already learning to recognize hollow reassurances. The thought made something ache in Morella's chest. She was failing them, not by being a bad mother, but by tolerating a situation that was teaching them terrible lessons about their own worth. After lunch, while the children napped, Morella found herself in the master bedroom for the first time in days. She'd been sleeping in the guest room lately, telling herself it was because Lorenzo came home so late she didn't want to be disturbed. The truth was, she couldn't bear to lie beside him anymore, couldn't pretend that physical proximity meant anything when the emotional distance between them had become an unbridgeable chasm. The bedroom looked like a museum display, perfectly decorated but utterly impersonal. Her things occupied one side, his the other, like roommates rather than spouses. When had that happened? When had they stopped sharing space, stopped intertwining their lives, stopped being a couple in anything but name? Morella opened Lorenzo's nightstand drawer, not sure what she was looking for. She found receipts from restaurants she'd never visited, tickets to shows she'd never attended, dry cleaning slips for suits she'd never seen him wear at home, evidence of a life he was living without her, parallel to their marriage but never intersecting with it. At the bottom of the drawer, she found a small velvet box. Her heart stuttered painfully. Jewelry, probably. Maybe he'd been planning to apologize for his absence, to smooth over the cracks with an expensive gift as if diamonds could fill the void where his presence should be. She opened the box. Inside was a delicate necklace, white gold with a single sapphire pendant. Beautiful, expensive, completely impersonal. The kind of gift a man bought when his assistant handled his personal shopping. No note, no card, just cold metal and stone that represented everything wrong with their marriage. He could buy her things, could provide material comfort, but couldn't offer the one thing she actually needed, Himself. Morella closed the box and returned it to the drawer. She didn't want jewelry. She wanted a partner. She wanted someone who noticed when she was struggling, who responded when she asked for help, who remembered that love required more than financial support. She wanted the man Lorenzo had been when they first met, when he'd made time for her, when he'd seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings and dreams. That man no longer existed, if he ever truly had. The man who'd replaced him was a stranger who occasionally visited the house they shared, who paid the bills and expected gratitude for doing the bare minimum, who thought providing material comfort absolved him of providing emotional support. Her phone buzzed. Finally, Lorenzo's name appeared on the screen. Morella stared at it for a long moment before opening the message. "Sorry, busy day yesterday. Everything okay?" 6 words. After 24 hours of silence following her SOS, after ignoring what was clearly a distress signal, he offered 6 casual words that suggested he'd simply forgotten to respond to a routine message. No concern, no urgency, no indication that he understood those 3 letters had meant his wife was in crisis. Morella's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could explain, could tell him about the panic attack, could express her hurt at being ignored when she needed him most. She could start another fight that would end with empty promises and temporary change before everything reverted to this painful status quo. Or she could stop, could finally accept what had become undeniable. Their marriage was over in every way that mattered. They were already living separate lives. The only question was whether she'd continue pretending otherwise, or whether she'd find the courage to acknowledge reality and move forward. Her response came from someplace deeper than conscious thought, from the part of her that had fractured yesterday and was beginning to reassemble into something different, something harder, something that refused to disappear quietly anymore. "Don't worry about me anymore. Just take care of the children when you see them. I don't have the strength to keep fighting for something you gave up on a long time ago." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The message showed as delivered, then read almost immediately. She watched the typing indicator appear, disappear, appear again. Lorenzo was clearly struggling to formulate a response, probably shocked that she'd finally stopped accepting his non-answers and hollow reassurances. The typing indicator continued for several minutes. Morella waited, her heart pounding, wondering what he'd say. Would he finally wake up? Finally recognize what he was losing? Would he call, demand to talk in person, fight to save what remained of their marriage? Finally, his response came through. "Morella, what are you saying? Can we talk about this later? I'm in the middle of something important." She laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Even now, faced with his wife essentially ending their marriage, he couldn't prioritize her. Still had something more important demanding his attention. Still believed she'd wait indefinitely for scraps of his time and consideration. "No," she typed back. "We can't talk later. We should have talked months ago. Years ago, maybe. But it's too late now. I'm done, Lorenzo. I'm done waiting for you to remember you have a family. I'm done being invisible in my own marriage. I'm done teaching our children that this is what love looks like." This time she didn't wait for his response. She turned off her phone, silencing whatever excuses or protestations he might offer. They'd all be variations of the same themes anyway. He'd been busy, under pressure, dealing with important matters. He'd promised to change, to do better, to make her a priority. He might even believe it himself for a moment. But nothing would actually change, because the problem wasn't that Lorenzo didn't know what she needed. The problem was that meeting those needs required sacrifices he wasn't willing to make. The clarity that washed over her felt like emerging from underwater after nearly drowning. Yes, ending her marriage was terrifying. Yes, single parenthood would be challenging. Yes, there would be financial complications and social judgment and painful conversations ahead. But at least she'd be able to breathe. At least she'd stopped slowly disappearing into the shadow of a man who'd stopped seeing her long ago. Morella pulled her suitcase from the closet and began to pack, her movements mechanical but purposeful. She didn't take much, just essentials for herself and the children. Lorenzo could keep the house, the expensive furniture, all the material possessions that had never made her happy anyway. She just wanted out, wanted space to remember who she'd been before becoming Mrs. Lorenzo Viscari wanted the opportunity to be someone her children could respect, rather than pity. Sofia and Marco would wake soon from their naps. She'd load them in the car, drive to her childhood home where her mother still lived, and figure out the rest from there. One step at a time. One day at a time. Learning to build a life that wasn't defined by someone else's absence. Her wedding ring sat on the dresser, catching afternoon light. Morella looked at it for a long moment, remembering the day Lorenzo had slid it onto her finger, promising forever. She'd believed him then, had built her entire future around that belief. Now she understood that forever meant different things to different people. For her, it had meant commitment, partnership, choosing each other every day. For Lorenzo, it had apparently meant providing financial security while his actual life happened elsewhere. She left the ring where it lay, a small circle of gold that represented promises neither of them had been able to keep, and walked out of the bedroom without looking back, ready to finally stop disappearing and start becoming visible again, even if that meant doing it alone. Lorenzo stared at his phone screen, reading Morella's messages for the 5th time. The words hadn't changed, but their meaning seemed to shift with each reading, becoming more real, more final, more devastating. She was done. After 5 years of marriage, after 2 children, after building a life together, his wife was simply done. And somehow, he'd missed every warning sign that had led to this moment. His office felt suffocating despite its generous dimensions. The mahogany desk his father had imported from Italy, the leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking his empire, none of it provided comfort now. Everything that had once represented success now felt hollow, meaningless in the face of what he'd apparently lost while he wasn't paying attention. "Mr. Viscari?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your 2 o'clock is here. Should I send them in?" Lorenzo looked at his calendar, seeing meetings stacked back to back until well past dinner time. Important meetings, he'd thought when he scheduled them. Critical for business, essential for maintaining his position, impossible to reschedule without consequences. But now, looking at Morella's final message still glowing on his screen, he wondered what he'd actually been prioritizing all this time. "Cancel it," he said. "Cancel everything today. I need to go home." A pause, loaded with surprise. He never canceled meetings, never put personal matters before business obligations. His reputation for ruthless reliability was part of what made him formidable in negotiations. "Are you certain? The Castellano deal." "I said cancel it." His voice came out harsher than intended. "Reschedule for next week. Make apologies. I don't care what you have to do." He grabbed his jacket and headed for the elevator before his assistant could respond, before he could second-guess this decision, before the habits of years could override this unfamiliar impulse to prioritize his family. The drive home felt endless despite the lack of traffic. Every red light a torture, every slow driver an obstacle between him and whatever disaster he'd finally managed to create through years of accumulated neglect. The house looked the same as always when he pulled into the circular driveway. Immaculate, expensive, impressive from every angle. He'd been so proud when he first brought Morella here, had loved seeing her face light up at the space, the luxury, the security it represented. When had that initial joy curdled into something else? When had this house transformed from a home into an elegant cage? Lorenzo let himself in quietly, listening for sounds of his family. The silence that greeted him was absolute and wrong. Usually by this hour, he could hear Marco's endless questions, Sofia's delighted squeals, Morella's patient responses. Now, nothing. Just the oppressive quiet of an empty house. "Morella?" he called out, climbing the stairs 2 at a time. "Kids?" No answer. He checked their bedroom first, finding it exactly as he'd left it that morning, bed made with military precision, everything in its place. The children's rooms were similarly empty, though Sophia's building blocks were scattered across her carpet, abandoned mid-construction. Marco's dragon drawing lay on his desk, colors still vibrant. Lorenzo's phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "Why is Morella at my house with the children? What did you do?" Relief and dread warred in his chest. At least she hadn't disappeared completely, hadn't taken the children somewhere he couldn't find them. But the fact that she'd gone to his mother, that she'd left without even a note, suggested this wasn't a temporary cooling-off period. This was serious. This was possibly irreversible. He called his mother immediately. She answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with concern and barely suppressed anger. "Lorenzo, finally. What have you done to that poor girl?" "I don't know," he admitted, the truth tasting bitter. I know I've been working a lot, been absent, but I thought she understood. I thought we were okay." His mother's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Understood? Lorenzo, your wife has been drowning for months while you were too busy building your empire to notice. Did you know she sent you an SOS yesterday? Did you even bother to respond?" The accusation hit like a physical blow. "She told you about that?" "She didn't have to tell me anything. I have eyes. I've watched her disappearing inch by inch every time I visit. I've watched my grandchildren learn that their father is just a ghost who occasionally appears to remind them he exists. I warned you this would happen. Your father made the same mistakes, and I won't watch you repeat them." Lorenzo sank onto the stairs, his legs suddenly unable to support him. "I need to talk to her. I need to explain." "Explain what?" "How you were too busy to respond when she needed help. How you've been spending your time with that woman." "Yes, Lorenzo, I know about Serena. The whole family knows. The question is whether your wife knows, and whether that's the final straw that broke her." Shame burned through him, hot and horrible. "How long have you known?" "Does it matter? What matters is that you've been throwing away your family for what? A woman who's clearly only interested in your money? A business empire that will mean nothing if you have no one to share it with? You're more like your father than I feared, and that's not a compliment. Let me talk to Morella, please." A long pause, filled with his mother's disapproving silence. Finally, "She doesn't want to see you. She's barely holding herself together, Lorenzo. Those children keep asking where their father is. Why Mama's crying when they're going home. What am I supposed to tell them?" "Tell them I'm coming. Tell them I'll fix this." "Some things can't be fixed with money or promises, my son. Some things, once broken, stay broken. Maybe it's time you learned that lesson before you lose everything that actually matters." She hung up before he could respond. Lorenzo sat on the stairs of his empty house, surrounded by expensive things that suddenly felt worthless, and tried to remember when he'd stopped being the kind of man his wife could depend on. The kind of father his children deserved. The kind of husband he'd promised to be. His phone showed a text notification from Serena. "Tonight?" She'd added a suggestive emoji, clearly expecting their usual arrangement to continue without interruption. Lorenzo looked at the message and felt nothing but revulsion. What had he been thinking? What possible justification could exist for risking his family, his marriage, his children's happiness for someone who wouldn't look twice at him if he lost his money tomorrow? Serena had never been anything more than a transaction, an ego boost purchased at the cost of everything real in his life. He typed a response. "We're done. Don't contact me again." Before she could reply, he blocked her number. It wouldn't fix what he'd broken, wouldn't erase months of betrayal, but it was a start. a small first step toward becoming someone who deserved a second chance, if second chances were even still possible. The house felt like a mausoleum as Lorenzo wandered through it, seeing it through new eyes. Morella's touches were everywhere, the careful decorating choices that had turned this showcase into something resembling a home. Photos of the children at various ages, artwork they'd created proudly displayed, small personal items that reflected her taste and personality. She'd built a life here, had tried to create warmth in these cold, expensive rooms. And he'd been too busy, too distracted, too absent to appreciate any of it. In the kitchen, he found a grocery list in her handwriting. Simple things: milk, bread, fruit for the children, pasta for easy dinners. The mundane evidence of her life managing household details while he was off doing what he'd convinced himself were more important things. When had he started believing that making money mattered more than being present? When had he adopted his father's ruthless prioritization of business over everything else? His mother's words echoed in his mind. Your father made the same mistakes. Lorenzo had spent his childhood watching his parents' marriage slowly die, watching his mother become a beautifully dressed ghost in her own home, watching his father justify endless absences with speeches about legacy and responsibility and sacrifice. He'd sworn he'd be different, that when he had a family, they'd come first, that he wouldn't repeat his father's mistakes. And yet, here he was, having replicated those exact patterns without even noticing. Too proud to admit he was becoming the man he'd once pitied. Too stubborn to change course, even when the destination became obviously destructive. Too convinced of his own importance to recognize that his family was building a life that didn't include him anymore because he'd made it clear he didn't want to be included. Lorenzo pulled out his phone and called his attorney. I need you to do something for me. Transfer half of everything I own into an account under Morella's name, sole access, no strings attached, and draw up documents giving her full custody of the children. Whatever she decides about our marriage, I want her to know she's financially secure and the kids are protected. Lorenzo, I'd strongly advise against making such significant decisions in an emotional state. Perhaps we should meet next week to discuss. Do it today. I'll sign whatever needs signing. She deserves security regardless of what happens between us. After arranging the financial matters, Lorenzo drove to his mother's house, his heart hammering against his ribs with every mile. What would he say to Morella? How could he possibly explain years of neglect, months of affair, a marriage he'd let die through indifference? Sorry seemed laughably inadequate. Promises to change felt hollow after so many broken ones. But he had to try. Had to at least let her know that he finally understood what he'd done, what he'd lost, what he'd sacrificed for an empire that meant nothing without her in it. His mother's house was modest compared to his own, warm and lived in ways his showcase had never achieved. He could hear children's voices from the backyard as he approached the front door. His mother met him there, her expression stern, but not entirely without sympathy. She doesn't want to see you, his mother said before he could speak. She made that very clear. I know, but I need to talk to her anyway. Please, Mama. I need to at least try. His mother studied him for a long moment, seeing something in his face that made her expression soften slightly. 5 minutes. If she asks you to leave, you leave immediately. Understood? He nodded, following her into the house. Morella sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea growing cold before her. She looked up as he entered, and the emptiness in her eyes struck him harder than anger would have. She wasn't furious or betrayed or hurt. She was simply done, the light that used to brighten when she saw him completely extinguished. Morella, please, let me explain. Explain what, Lorenzo? Her voice was quiet, eerily calm. How you were too busy to respond when I needed help. How you've been spending your time with another woman. How you've spent years building a life that doesn't include me except as a convenient caretaker for your children. The clinical accuracy of her words, the complete absence of emotion in her delivery, was more devastating than any accusation could have been. She'd moved past anger into acceptance, past hurt into resignation. She'd already grieved their marriage and moved on, all while he'd been too occupied to notice she was mourning. I want to fix this. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I can change. I will change. Just tell me what you need. Morella finally looked directly at him, and the compassion in her eyes made him realize how completely he'd lost her. That's the problem, Lorenzo. You think there's something I can tell you, some list of requirements you can fulfill to solve this. But I've been telling you what I need for months. For years, actually. I've needed a partner, a presence, someone who remembers he has a family. And you've had 1,000 chances to hear me, to change, to choose us. You didn't. Not until I finally stopped waiting. I'm choosing you now. I'm here now. Yes, now that I've left, now that there are consequences, suddenly you have time. But what about next week, next month? When the urgent business returns, when the meetings stack up, when being here becomes inconvenient again. We'll be right back where we were, except now I'll have even less self-respect for taking you back. Lorenzo had never felt more helpless in his life. Every argument she made was irrefutable. Every point she raised was completely valid. He had no defense, no counter-argument, nothing but the hollow recognition that she was right about everything. What about the children? He asked finally, grasping at the only thing that might matter to her more than her own pain. What about them? Morella's voice remained level, but he saw emotion flicker across her face for the first time. You think I'd keep them from their father? You think I'm doing this to punish you? I'm doing this because staying was teaching them terrible lessons about love, about relationships, about their own worth. They were learning that it's acceptable to be ignored, to be an afterthought, to settle for scraps of attention from someone who's supposed to cherish you. I won't model that anymore. She stood, moving toward the door, clearly done with this conversation. You can see them whenever you want, Lorenzo. I won't be petty about custody or visitation. But as for us, as for our marriage, that ended a long time ago. Yesterday just made it official when you couldn't even be bothered to check if I was okay after I literally sent you a distress signal. That told me everything I needed to know about where I rank in your priorities. You're wrong. You're my highest priority. You and the children. Morella smiled sadly. No, we're not. And maybe we never were. Maybe I was just naive enough to believe we could compete with your empire, your reputation, your desperate need to prove you're better than your father by becoming exactly like him. But I'm done competing for attention from someone who's already chosen what matters most. I hope it keeps you warm at night, Lorenzo. I really do. Because it's all you're going to have left. She walked out, leaving him standing in his mother's kitchen, finally understanding what he'd lost, and exactly how he'd lost it. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was knowing she was right. About all of it. He'd had countless chances to change, to do better, to remember what actually mattered. And he'd squandered every single one, convinced that tomorrow would be soon enough, that she'd understand one more day, that his family would always be there waiting when he finally got around to prioritizing them. Now tomorrow had arrived, and his family was building a life without him in it. And he had no one to blame but himself. 3 months had passed since Morella left, though to Lorenzo it felt simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago. He'd become intimately familiar with the peculiar torture of watching your family exist without you, of being relegated from central figure to occasional visitor in your children's lives. Every Wednesday and every other weekend, he had Marco and Sophia, and those hours had become both the highlight and the deepest agony of his existence. Today was Wednesday. Lorenzo had left work at 3, a shock to his staff who were still adjusting to his new schedule. The empire hadn't collapsed from his reduced hours, another uncomfortable truth he'd been forced to confront. All those years of insisting his constant presence was essential had been largely self-aggrandizement. His managers were perfectly capable of handling daily operations. His presence had been important, but not indispensable, a reality that undermined years of justifications for his absence from home. He pulled up to his mother's house where Morella was now living. The modest single story that had somehow become more of a home than his mansion had ever been. The front yard showed evidence of his children's presence. Chalk drawings on the driveway, a small bike with training wheels leaning against the porch. Sophia's beloved stuffed rabbit abandoned on the front steps. Normal, everyday evidence of childhood that he'd barely noticed when they lived with him. Before he could knock, the door flew open and Marco launched himself forward. "Daddy!" The force of his son's greeting nearly knocked Lorenzo backward. He caught Marco, lifting him easily despite the boy's growth over recent months. Sophia appeared in the doorway a moment later, more reserved but no less excited. At 2, she didn't fully understand why Daddy no longer lived with them, but she'd learned to treasure these Wednesday visits. "Hey, buddy. Hey, sweetheart." Lorenzo's voice caught as Sophia wrapped her small arms around his leg. These greetings never got easier, the joy always tinged with the aching awareness of how much he'd risked losing completely. Morella appeared behind the children, and Lorenzo's breath caught as it did every time he saw her now. She looked different, he'd noticed over these months. Healthier somehow, despite the obvious challenges of single parenting. The perpetual exhaustion that had shadowed her eyes during their marriage had faded. She moved with a lightness she hadn't possessed in years. And while that should have made him happy, should have proven she was thriving without the weight of their broken marriage, it actually hurt worse than anything else. She was better off without him. Demonstrably, visibly better off. "They've been ready for an hour," Morella said with a small smile that was polite but distant. "Marco wanted to wear his special shirt you got him." Sophia picked out her favorite dress. "They look perfect." Lorenzo drank in the sight of his children in their carefully chosen outfits, evidence of how much these visits meant to them. "I thought we'd go to the park, maybe get ice cream after." "Sounds good. I'll have them back by 7? It was phrased as a question, but they both knew it was a schedule. Clear boundaries, explicit expectations. Nothing left to interpretation or hope. Everything that had been absent from their marriage now rigidly present in their separation. "Actually," Lorenzo said, the words coming out before he'd fully planned them, "I was wondering if we could talk. Later, after I bring them back. Just for a few minutes." Something flickered in Morella's expression, wariness and resignation. "Lorenzo, we've talked. Multiple times. Nothing's changed. I know. I need you to hear something. Please." She studied him for a long moment before nodding once. "After they're in bed. 30 minutes. That's all I can give you." It was more than he deserved, and they both knew it. "Thank you." The afternoon with Marco and Sophia was bittersweet perfection. They played at the park, Marco demonstrating how high he could climb on the jungle gym, while Sophia demanded endless pushes on the swings. Lorenzo forced himself to be completely present, phone turned off, no thoughts of business or obligations. Just these few precious hours with his children, making memories to sustain him through the days when he wouldn't see them. Over ice cream, Marco asked the question that had been coming for weeks. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" Lorenzo's throat constricted. How did you explain adult failings to a 4-year-old? How did you admit that you destroyed your family through selfishness and neglect without destroying your child's sense of security? "Buddy, remember what Mama explained? Daddy has his house and Mama has her house with Grandma. But we both love you and Sophia very much. But I want us all together." Marco's lower lip trembled. "Like Tommy's family, they all live in the same house." "I know, sweetheart, I know." Lorenzo pulled his son close, feeling the weight of his failures in the small body pressed against his chest. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that mean things have to change. But what never changes is how much we love you. It was an inadequate answer, and Marco's expression showed he knew it. But what else could Lorenzo say? That he'd prioritized everything wrong and destroyed his family in the process? That by the time he'd realized what he was losing, it was already gone? That his son's unhappiness was entirely his father's fault? Sophia, less burdened by understanding, simply enjoyed her ice cream and chattered about her new friend at the daycare Morella had enrolled her in. But even in her innocent commentary, Lorenzo heard evidence of the new life his family was building without him. New routines, new friends, new experiences he wasn't part of anymore. 7 o'clock arrived too quickly. Lorenzo drove them back, both children dozing in their car seats, exhausted from the afternoon's activities. Morella met them at the door, helping carry his sleeping daughter inside, while Lorenzo managed Marco. They moved through the bedtime routine with practiced efficiency, years of co-parenting compressed into these brief handoffs. After the children were settled, Morella led him to the small back patio where she'd set out 2 cups of coffee. The gesture reminded him painfully of their early relationship, when they'd spent hours talking over coffee, discovering each other's dreams and fears. How had they gotten from there to here? "So," Morella said, settling into one of the patio chairs with her cup. "What did you want to talk about?" Lorenzo had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but now that the moment had arrived, his prepared words felt hollow. "I've been making changes. Real changes. I've restructured my work schedule, delegated more responsibilities, hired additional management. I'm home by 6 every night, even on days I don't have the kids." "That's good, Lorenzo. I'm glad you're finding better balance." Her tone was genuinely approving, but also completely neutral, as if discussing a colleague's life choices rather than her husband's attempts at redemption. "I ended things with Serena the day you left. Haven't spoken to her since. Actually blocked her number." "Okay." Still that same neutral tone, neither impressed nor dismissive, just acknowledging information. "I've been going to therapy, trying to understand how I became so much like my father, how I repeated his mistakes despite swearing I never would. It's been helpful, painful, but helpful." Morella nodded, sipping her coffee. "That's really good, Lorenzo. Genuinely. You deserve to be happy and healthy." But he could hear the unspoken qualifier in her voice. "But none of that changes what happened between us. None of that erases the years of neglect, the affair, the fact that you only started making these changes after I left. You're becoming a better person, and I'm genuinely glad about that. But you're not becoming my husband again. That part is over." The finality in her voice should have prepared him, but it still landed like a blow. "You can't mean that. We have children together, a history. We were happy once." "Yes, we were. Once. A long time ago, before you decided your empire was more important than your family. Before you started treating me like a convenient accessory rather than a partner. Before you stopped seeing me entirely." She set down her coffee cup, her expression sad, but resolved. "Lorenzo, I spent years disappearing, slowly becoming less of myself until I was just a ghost managing your household. I won't go back to that. I can't go back to that, even if I wanted to. I'm different now. You've learned not to take me for granted because I left. That's not the same as valuing me because you love me. That's fear of consequences, not actual change. And the minute you felt secure again, the minute you thought you'd done enough penance, you'd slide right back into those same patterns. Because that's who you are, Lorenzo. That's who your father taught you to be. That's not fair." But even as he said it, Lorenzo wondered if she was right. Would he maintain these changes indefinitely? Or would they gradually erode once the immediate crisis passed? He wanted to believe he was fundamentally different now, but wanting something didn't make it true. Maybe it's not fair, Morella acknowledged. But it's realistic. I know you, Lorenzo. I know how you operate. You're good in a crisis, excellent at solving immediate problems. But the day-to-day work of maintaining a relationship, the constant small choices to prioritize your partner, the emotional availability required for real intimacy, those aren't your strengths. And I'm not willing to spend the rest of my life hoping you'll change in fundamental ways you've shown no capacity for changing. So that's it? You've just decided our marriage is over, and nothing I do matters? It's not that nothing you do matters. What you're doing is important and valuable, just not sufficient to rebuild what we had. You're becoming a better father, and that matters enormously for Marco and Sofia. You're becoming a healthier person, and that matters for you, but us? The marriage? That required work we should have been doing years ago, and I don't have the energy or desire to start now. I'm tired, Lorenzo. I'm tired of fighting for a relationship alone. I'm tired of being disappointed. I'm tired of feeling like I'm never enough to make you choose me. I'm just tired. The exhaustion in her voice was more devastating than anger would have been. She wasn't fighting him anymore, wasn't engaging emotionally. She'd simply moved on, had grieved their relationship and accepted its ending, was building a new life in which he played a supporting role at best. I love you, Lorenzo said, the words desperate and true. I still love you, Morella. I know I haven't shown it, haven't earned the right to say it. But it's true. She smiled sadly. I know you do. In your way, with the capacity you have, you love me. But Lorenzo, your love was never enough when it came with so many conditions and caveats. When it was always secondary to everything else in your life. I needed to be chosen, to be prioritized, to be seen. And you couldn't give me that. Maybe didn't know how to give me that. Either way, the result is the same. So what now? We just exist in separate orbits, co-parenting cordially until the kids are grown. Yes, that's exactly what we do. We build a respectful relationship as parents because our children deserve that. But the marriage, the romance, the idea of us as a couple, that part is over. And honestly, Lorenzo, I think it's been over for a long time. We were both just too scared, or stubborn, or inertial to admit it. Lorenzo wanted to argue, to insist that they could rebuild what they'd lost. But looking at Morella now, at the peace in her expression despite the sadness, at the quiet strength she'd regained since leaving him, he recognized the truth in her words. She was better without him. Happier, healthier, more herself than she'd been in years. And his love, if it was truly love, had to include wanting what was best for her, even when that meant accepting she was better off without him. I'm sorry, he said finally, for all of it. For being the husband you needed me to be. For waiting until it was too late to try changing. For making you feel invisible in your own marriage. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. Yes, I did. There was no cruelty in the agreement, just honesty. But you're giving our children something better now, and that's what matters going forward. They need a present father more than I need an apologetic husband. They sat in silence for a while, the evening air cooling around them. Lorenzo thought about all the conversations they'd never had, all the moments he'd missed, all the choices that had seemed so critical at the time, but had led him here, to this quiet ending of everything he'd once considered permanent. Can I ask one thing? Lorenzo said finally. Of course. Are you happy? I mean, really happy. Morella considered the question seriously. I'm getting there. Some days are hard, especially financially. Single parenting is exhausting. But yes, I'm happier than I was. I feel like myself again, like I'm not constantly shrinking to accommodate someone else's priorities. So yes, I'd say I'm moving toward happy. It was the answer he'd expected, but it still hurt. She was happy without him, was becoming happier every day as she built a life that didn't include him. And he had to accept that, had to support it, had to be grateful that at least his failures hadn't destroyed her completely. I should go, Lorenzo said, standing. Let you get some rest. Thank you for talking to me, for being honest. I know I don't deserve your kindness. We're both Marco and Sophia's parents, Lorenzo. We'll be in each other's lives forever because of them. We might as well make it as pleasant as possible. He nodded, understanding that this was the best he could hope for. Not reconciliation, not romance, not the restoration of what he destroyed, just cordial cooperation in raising the children they both loved. It was so much less than he'd once had, less than he'd taken for granted for years, but it was infinitely more than he deserved, and he was grateful for even this small grace. As he drove away, Lorenzo looked back at the modest house, seeing lights go on in the children's rooms where Morella was probably checking on them before bed. This had become their life now. Separate households, divided time, a family fractured by his choices. And while he couldn't undo the past, couldn't reclaim what he'd carelessly discarded, he could at least try to be the father his children deserved, even if he'd failed completely at being the husband Morella had needed. It wasn't enough, would never be enough. But it was all he had left to offer, and he'd spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of even this diminished role in their lives. 6 months after Morella left, Lorenzo discovered what Serena Hale had truly been after all along. The revelation came through his attorney on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, delivered with the clinical precision of someone reporting a terminal diagnosis. Mr. Vascari, we've discovered irregularities in several accounts. His attorney's voice carried carefully controlled alarm. Significant withdrawals and transfers dating back approximately 8 months, all authorized with signatures that appear to be yours, but which we now suspect are forgeries. Lorenzo felt ice crystallize in his veins. How much? Approximately 3 million, spread across various accounts and dummy corporations. The sophistication suggests professional assistance, someone with intimate knowledge of your financial structure. Someone like Serena, who'd had months of access to his computers, his phones, his private documents, who'd asked seemingly innocent questions about his business operations, questions he'd answered while basking in the glow of her attention, who'd played him perfectly while he was too arrogant and distracted to recognize the con. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of his stupidity. Serena Hale wasn't even her real name. She was Sarah Mendez, a professional grifter, with a history of targeting wealthy men. The whole relationship had been calculated from their first meeting, every smile rehearsed, every touch transactional, every moment of apparent intimacy a performance designed to extract maximum value before disappearing. She'd vanished 2 weeks after Lorenzo had ended things, the same day the transferred funds had been moved through several international accounts and disappeared entirely. By the time he'd discovered the theft, she was gone, untraceable, probably already setting up her next mark in another city. Lorenzo should have been furious, should have been humiliated by how easily he'd been manipulated, how spectacularly he'd been played. Instead, he felt nothing but a weary recognition that he'd gotten exactly what he deserved. He'd betrayed his wife for a woman who was literally robbing him blind, had sacrificed his family for an illusion so transparent that his own blindness was the only thing that made it work. The irony was almost poetic. He'd thought money could buy him everything: status, power, the freedom to indulge any desire without consequence. And in the end, his money had simply made him a more attractive target, had facilitated his own destruction. The news eventually reached Morella, filtered through family gossip and knowing looks. She called him one evening after the children were asleep, her voice carrying neither sympathy nor satisfaction. I heard about Serena. I'm sorry, Lorenzo. I know that must be difficult. Don't. He couldn't bear her kindness now, Not after everything. Don't be sorry for me. I earned every bit of this. Maybe, but I still don't enjoy seeing you hurt. A pause, weighted with history. The kids have been asking why you seem sad during visits. I wanted to give you a heads up that Marco's old enough to sense something's wrong. Lorenzo closed his eyes against the burn of tears he hadn't allowed himself since childhood. Even now, even after everything, Morella was protecting him, helping him navigate fatherhood because she put their children's well-being above her own justified resentment. She was a better person than he'd ever been, and he'd lost her while chasing a shadow who'd never been real at all. Tell them I'm fine. That daddy's just dealing with work stress, which is true, in its way. Lorenzo, if you need to talk. I don't deserve your concern, Morella. I destroyed our marriage for a woman who was literally stealing from me the entire time we were together. I ignored your SOS while I was off being conned by a professional grifter. I have no right to your sympathy or your time beyond what's necessary for the children. You're still their father. That still matters. Does it? Because I'm beginning to think I've failed at everything that actually matters. Marriage, fidelity, basic awareness of reality. At least I haven't managed to completely screw up being their father, though it's still early days. He heard her sigh, that familiar sound of exasperation and compassion that had once been such a constant in his life. You're not a complete failure, Lorenzo. You're just a man who made terrible choices and is now facing the consequences. Join the rest of humanity. The consequences of my choices destroyed our family. No, they destroyed our marriage. Our family still exists. It's just different now. The kids are adapting, I'm adapting, and eventually you'll adapt too. This isn't the ending you wanted, but it doesn't have to be a complete disaster either. After they hung up, Lorenzo poured himself a drink and stood at the windows of his penthouse, looking out over the city he'd once felt he conquered. The empire his father had built, that he'd expanded, that had demanded so much sacrifice. It all felt meaningless now. A glittering cage he'd built for himself, while convincing himself it was freedom. His phone showed recent photos from Marco and Sophia's visit last weekend. Marco grinning with ice cream on his face. Sophia asleep on his lap during a movie. Evidence that he was managing to be present for them now, managing to be the father they deserved, even if he'd failed spectacularly at being the husband Morella had needed. It should have felt like victory, this evidence that he was changing, growing, becoming better. Instead, it felt hollow. Because the only person he wanted to share these moments with, the only person whose approval would have meant anything, had moved on completely. Was building a life that didn't include him, except in carefully controlled increments. Lorenzo saw her occasionally beyond the custody handoffs. At school events, birthday parties, family gatherings his mother insisted on hosting despite the obvious discomfort. Morella was always gracious, always cordial, treating him with the polite distance one might extend to a pleasant acquaintance. No anger, no resentment, but also no warmth, no lingering connection, no suggestion that they'd once known each other intimately. She'd truly moved on, had grieved their marriage, accepted its ending, and stepped into a new life with apparent ease. Sometimes he caught her laughing with his sister, saw her relaxed in ways she'd never been during their marriage, and while he was genuinely glad she'd found peace, it hurt worse than any anger could have, because she was better without him. Demonstrably, obviously better, which meant their marriage hadn't just failed, it had been actively harmful to her. She'd been slowly disappearing under the weight of his neglect, and removing that weight had allowed her to return to herself. The woman he'd fallen in love with had been there all along, just buried under years of accumulated disappointment and resignation. A year passed, then 2. Lorenzo maintained his revised schedule, continued therapy, rebuilt some aspects of his life while accepting that others were irreparably broken. He saw his children regularly, built genuine relationships with them now that he was actually present. Marco started kindergarten. Sophia began preschool. They grew and changed, and he was there to witness it, participate in it, be part of it in ways he'd never managed during his marriage. But the loneliness was crushing. The penthouse felt emptier every night. The bed seemed vast and cold. The silence was oppressive in ways it had never been when he'd convinced himself solitude was freedom, rather than isolation. He'd traded his family for an empire that couldn't keep him warm, for success that tasted like ash, for power that meant nothing without someone to share it with. Sometimes he saw Morella smile at something one of the children said, saw the lightness in her expression, the ease in her posture, and he understood with painful clarity that he'd had something precious, something irreplaceable, and had discarded it for illusions and lies because he'd been too arrogant to recognize value when it lived beside him every day. The final realization came on a spring evening, 2 years after their separation. Lorenzo had picked up the children for his Wednesday visit, and Marco had immediately launched into excited chatter about Mama's new friend, a teacher at his school who'd apparently been coming around occasionally. Mr. David is really nice. He helped Mama fix the fence and he brings us cookies, and he makes Mama laugh a lot. Lorenzo had frozen, the casual mention landing like a physical blow. Of course, Morella was moving on completely, meeting other people, building a new life that might eventually include someone else. She was still young, still beautiful, still the kind of person anyone would be lucky to have. Why shouldn't she find someone who would treat her the way she deserved, who would prioritize her the way Lorenzo never had? The jealousy was irrational and completely inappropriate. He had no claim on her anymore, no right to feel anything but happiness, that she might find joy again. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were entirely different things, and Lorenzo spent that entire visit with his children in a fog of misery he couldn't quite shake. When he dropped them off that evening, Morella immediately noticed something was wrong. "Lorenzo, are you okay?" "Marco mentioned Mr. David," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "I'm glad you're finding happiness. You deserve it." Something complicated crossed her face. "David is a friend. The kids have gotten ahead of themselves. But yes, I'm dating occasionally. Not seriously, but I'm open to possibilities now." She studied him carefully. "Does that bother you?" "I have no right for it to bother me. You've moved on, as you should. I hope whoever eventually earns your trust treats you the way I didn't. The way you always deserved." Morella's expression softened with something that looked like pity, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. "Lorenzo, you need to move forward too. Not necessarily dating, but letting go of what we were. Accepting that this is our reality now. We're co-parents, and we're doing a good job of it. But the marriage, the romance, the idea of us together, that needs to stay in the past for both our sakes." She was right, of course. She was always right these days, had a clarity about their situation that he still struggled to accept. He needed to let go, to stop waiting for some impossible reconciliation, to accept that his choices had closed certain doors permanently. But understanding what he should do and actually doing it proved to be different things entirely. Because Lorenzo had finally learned the lesson his mother had tried to teach him years ago, that empires crumble, that money disappears, that power fades. But family, real family built on love and respect and presence, that was the only thing that truly lasted. And he'd learned it too late, after he'd already lost what mattered most, after he'd already proven himself incapable of cherishing what he'd been given. The final irony was that he'd become, in many ways, the man Morella had needed him to be. Present, attentive, emotionally available, prioritizing family over business. But he'd become that man only after losing his family, only in the aftermath of catastrophic failure. The change was real, but it didn't matter anymore. He was a better person now, but he was a better person alone, watching his former wife build a new life while he existed in the margins of his children's world, forever the visiting father, rather than the present husband he should have been all along. And he had no one to blame but himself. No one to resent but the man he'd been, the choices he'd made, the priorities he'd established. He'd gotten everything he'd thought he wanted: success, power, freedom from domestic obligations, and it had cost him everything that actually mattered. It was, Lorenzo reflected in his quiet moments, exactly what he deserved. Not justice, perhaps, but consequences. And he would spend the rest of his life living with those consequences, watching his family thrive without him, being grateful for the small role he'd managed to salvage, while mourning the life he'd carelessly destroyed. Some mistakes couldn't be fixed, some damage couldn't be repaired, some losses were permanent, and all the money in the world, all the power and status and empire, couldn't buy back a single moment of what he'd thrown away. That was his punishment, and it was appropriate. To finally understand the value of what he'd lost, but only after it was irretrievably gone. To become the man he should have been, but too late for it to matter. To love his wife completely, finally, with the depth she'd always deserved, but only after she'd stopped being his wife at all. It was a hollow victory indeed, this self-awareness that came with perfect hindsight and no remaining opportunity for redemption. And Lorenzo would carry that hollowness for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of what love looked like when it was given too late to the wrong priorities by someone who finally understood their value only after they'd disappeared entirely.